The renowned New York restaurant buzzed with activity. Chefs rushed about, their white uniforms a blur of motion as they prepared for the evening rush. The air was thick with the aroma of sizzling meats and aromatic spices. At the center of this controlled chaos stood Jake Thompson, the head chef. Jake's crisp white uniform was impeccable, not a single stain marring its pristine surface. His tall chef's hat sat perfectly straight on his head, a symbol of his authority in the kitchen. Jake's eyes, sharp and critical, scanned the bustling kitchen. His gaze lingered on each station, noting every detail with a mixture of pride and disdain. As Jake surveyed his domain, his eyes fell on Lavinia Carter. The elderly woman was hunched over a prep station, her weathered hands carefully organizing ingredients. Despite her age, Lavinia moved with purpose, her actions precise and efficient. However, this wasn't enough for Jake. With a scowl twisting his features, Jake strode over to Lavinia's station. His voice, loud and harsh, cut through the kitchen noise. "Carter, what's taking so long? We don't have all day for you to shuffle around like a useless old woman." Lavinia's hands paused momentarily, the only indication that she had heard Jake's cutting remarks. She took a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling slowly. When she turned to face Jake, her eyes were calm, but a flicker of pain passed through them. "I assure you, Chef Thompson, the mise en place will be ready on time," Lavinia responded, her voice steady and dignified. She held Jake's gaze, refusing to be cowed by his aggression. Jake sneered, unimpressed by Lavinia's composure. "It better be. I don't know why we keep you around. You're nothing but dead weight in this kitchen." With that parting shot, he turned on his heel and stalked away. As Jake moved on to berate another member of his staff, Lavinia returned to her work. Her movements remained steady, but there was a new tension in her shoulders. Memories of past struggles flashed through her mind, the discrimination she had faced, the doors that had been closed to her because of her race and gender. Yet she had persevered, and she wouldn't let Jake's words deter her now. From across the kitchen, Miguel, a young line cook, watched the exchange with a mixture of anger and fear. He admired Lavinia's strength and dignity in the face of Jake's abuse. The older woman had taken Miguel under her wing when he first started at the restaurant, teaching him tricks of the trade and offering words of encouragement when the pressure of the kitchen became overwhelming. Miguel's hands clenched into fists as he fought the urge to defend Lavinia. He knew that standing up to Jake could cost him his job, and he couldn't afford to lose this position. The internal conflict tore at him, guilt warring with self-preservation. As the evening progressed, the tension in the kitchen remained high. Jake continued to prowl the kitchen, barking orders and criticisms in equal measure. His talented hands created culinary masterpieces, but his attitude poisoned the atmosphere. Lavinia, for her part, continued her work with quiet determination. She moved between stations, offering assistance where needed, and ensuring that everything ran smoothly. Her calm presence acted as a counterbalance to Jake's volatile energy. Miguel found himself gravitating towards Lavinia throughout the shift. He didn't dare to speak out against Jake, but he tried to lighten Lavinia's workload where he could. A small smile from the older woman was his reward, a silent acknowledgement of his efforts. As the dinner service wound down, Jake gathered the staff for a post-shift meeting. His eyes were hard as he critiqued the evening's performance, singling out individuals for harsh criticism. When he came to Lavinia, his words were particularly cutting. "Carter, your slow pace is dragging this kitchen down. If you can't keep up, maybe it's time to hang up your apron for good." The staff shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Lavinia stood straight, her dignity intact, despite Jake's attempts to humiliate her. "I assure you, Chef, I am more than capable of fulfilling my duties," she responded calmly. Jake dismissed the staff with a wave of his hand, his disdain evident. As the kitchen emptied, Lavinia remained behind, methodically cleaning her station. Miguel hesitated, torn between wanting to offer comfort and fearing Jake's reaction. In the end, Miguel approached Lavinia. "I'm sorry about Chef Thompson," he said quietly. You don't deserve that treatment." Lavinia offered him a small smile. "Thank you, Miguel, but don't worry about me. I've faced far worse in my time. This too shall pass." As they finished cleaning, Miguel couldn't help but wonder about Lavinia's past. What hardships had she endured? What secrets did she hold? And how long could this toxic situation continue before something finally broke? The bustling kitchen quieted as the lunch rush ended. Chefs and line cooks alike breathed sighs of relief, wiping sweat from their brows. In a corner of the kitchen, Lavinia Carter sat down heavily on a stool, her aged bones creaking in protest. Miguel, the young cook who had shown her kindness earlier, approached hesitantly. "Mind if I join you, Miss Carter?" Miguel asked, his voice low to avoid attracting attention. Lavinia nodded, gesturing to the empty stool beside her. As Miguel settled in, Lavinia's eyes took on a distant look. "You know, Miguel, seeing you stand up to injustice, even in small ways, reminds me of my younger days." Miguel leaned in, curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Lavinia's weathered hands clasped together in her lap. "I wasn't always just an old woman in a kitchen. Back in the 60s, I was a young chef with big dreams. But the world wasn't kind to a black woman trying to make it in the culinary world." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "I remember applying for a position at a high-end restaurant in Chicago. The head chef took one look at me and laughed. He said, 'The maid's entrance is around back, sweetheart.' But I stood my ground. I told him I was there for the chef position and I wasn't leaving until I got a fair shot." Miguel's eyes widened. "What happened?" "He tried to throw me out, but I came back the next day and the next. I stood outside that restaurant every day for 2 weeks in my best clothes with my knives and resume in hand. Eventually, one of the line cooks quit, and they were desperate enough to give me a chance." Lavinia's eyes sparkled with the memory. "I worked harder than anyone else in that kitchen. I had to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. But I did it. I climbed the ranks, and 5 years later, I was running that kitchen." Miguel sat in awe, trying to reconcile this fierce, determined woman with the quiet, unassuming Lavinia he knew. "That's incredible, Miss Carter. But how did you handle the discrimination, the constant put-downs?" Lavinia's face grew serious. "It wasn't easy, Miguel. There were days I wanted to give up, to believe what they said about me. But I found strength in the people who came before me, in the struggles they overcame. I told myself that every time I stepped into a kitchen, I was opening the door a little wider for the next person like me." As Lavinia spoke, Miguel felt a surge of inspiration. He thought about his own dreams of owning a restaurant, dreams that often felt out of reach for a young immigrant cook. "Ms. Carter, you've given me a lot to think about. I want to open my own place someday, a place where everyone is welcome both in the dining room and the kitchen." Lavinia smiled, patting Miguel's hand. "That's a beautiful dream, Miguel. Hold on to it. And remember, a kitchen should be like a good recipe. It needs a mix of different ingredients to create something truly special." Their moment of connection was abruptly shattered as Jake's voice boomed across the kitchen. "Break time's over. Carter, stop wasting time and get back to prep. Miguel, those dishes won't wash themselves." Lavinia and Miguel exchanged a look of understanding before returning to their stations. As Miguel began tackling the mountain of dishes, his mind raced with thoughts of his future restaurant. He imagined a diverse kitchen staff, each member bringing their unique experiences and cuisines to the table. He pictured a warm, welcoming dining room where people from all walks of life could come together over good food. The afternoon wore on, the kitchen once again a hive of activity as they prepared for the dinner service. Jake prowled the kitchen, his mood growing fouler by the minute. As the pressure mounted, so did Jake's temper. It all came to a head when Jake found Lavinia showing a new prep cook how to properly julienne vegetables. "Carter!" he bellowed. "Stop coddling the new blood. If they can't keep up, they don't belong here." Lavinia straightened up, facing Jake with quiet dignity. "Chef Thompson, teaching is part of our job. It ensures consistency and quality in the kitchen." Jake's face reddened with anger. "Don't tell me how to run my kitchen, you old bag. Your kind should know your place by now." A hush fell over the kitchen. Jake's words, laced with unmistakable racism, hung in the air like a noxious cloud. Lavinia stood perfectly still, her face a mask of control, but her eyes blazed with a mix of pain and defiance. Miguel, unable to contain himself any longer, stepped forward. "Chef, that's not right. You can't talk to Ms. Carter like that." Jake rounded on Miguel, his voice dripping with disdain. "You want to join her on dish duty for the rest of the month, boy? Mind your own business and get back to work." The tension in the kitchen was palpable. Staff members avoided eye contact, focusing intently on their tasks. Lavinia quietly returned to her station, her movements measured and deliberate. Miguel, his hands shaking with suppressed rage, threw himself into his work. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere remained heavy. Jake's outburst had crossed a line, and everyone felt it. Yet, the demands of the dinner service forced them to carry on. The clash of pans and sizzle of grills a discordant backdrop to the unresolved conflict. The kitchen door swung open with a bang, cutting through the tense atmosphere. David, the restaurant's owner, strode in, his normally cheerful face creased with concern. He took in the scene before him, Jake barking orders with more venom than usual, staff members hunched over their stations with rigid postures, and Lavinia working quietly in the corner, her face a mask of composure. David's eyes narrowed as he sensed the undercurrent of tension. He approached Jake, who was in the middle of berating a line cook for a slightly overcooked steak. "Jake, a word," David said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jake turned, his face flushed with anger. "What is it, David? We're in the middle of service here." David gestured towards his office. "It'll only take a minute. Come on." Reluctantly, Jake followed David to the small office tucked away in the corner of the kitchen. As soon as the door closed behind them, David spoke. "What's going on out there, Jake? The atmosphere is toxic." Jake scoffed, crossing his arms defensively. "It's a kitchen, David. It's supposed to be high pressure. If people can't handle it, they shouldn't be here." David leaned against his desk, his eyes never leaving Jake's face. "There's a difference between high pressure and hostile, Jake. I've been hearing complaints about your behavior, especially towards Lavinia." At the mention of Lavinia's name, Jake's face twisted with disdain. "That old woman, she's slowing us down. We'd be better off without her." David's expression hardened. "Lavinia is a valued member of this team, Jake. Her experience is invaluable, and she's respected by the rest of the staff. Your treatment of her is unacceptable." Jake's temper flared. "You're taking her side? I'm the one keeping this kitchen running. Without me, this place would fall apart." David stood up straight, his voice firm. "No one is irreplaceable, Jake. Not even you. I want you to think long and hard about your attitude and how it's affecting this team." With that, David opened the office door and walked out, leaving Jake seething. As David re-entered the kitchen, he noticed the staff's eyes darting between him and Jake, who stormed out of the office moments later. David sighed, realizing that more drastic measures might be necessary. He made his way to Lavinia's station, where she was calmly preparing garnishes. "Lavinia, do you have a moment?" Lavinia looked up, her eyes meeting David's. A flicker of understanding passed between them, unnoticed by the rest of the staff. "Of course, Mr. Chen," she replied, wiping her hands on her apron. David led her to a quiet corner of the kitchen. "I'm sorry about Jake's behavior," he began, his voice low. "It's unacceptable, and I want you to know that I'm addressing it." Lavinia nodded, her face betraying no emotion. "Thank you, David. I appreciate your concern." David hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I'm thinking of organizing a staff meeting to discuss the importance of respect and inclusion in our kitchen. I was hoping you might help me with that." A small smile tugged at the corners of Lavinia's mouth. "I'd be happy to, David. It's about time we addressed these issues head on." As they spoke, Jake watched from across the kitchen, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He couldn't hear their conversation, but the familiar way David spoke to Lavinia irked him. In his mind, David was undermining his authority by siding with a lowly prep cook. David returned to the center of the kitchen, clapping his hands to get everyone's attention. "Listen up, everyone. We're going to have a staff meeting tomorrow before service. Attendance is mandatory. We need to discuss some important matters regarding our work environment." A murmur rippled through the staff. Some looked relieved, others nervous, and a few shot glances at Jake, who stood with his arms crossed, a scowl etched on his face. As the announcement settled, Lavinia returned to her station. She caught Miguel's eye and gave him a reassuring nod. Miguel felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps things were finally going to change. The rest of the service proceeded with an undercurrent of anticipation. Jake, still bristling from his confrontation with David, was uncharacteristically quiet, though his eyes frequently darted to Lavinia with barely concealed animosity. As the last customers left and the kitchen began to wind down, Lavinia found herself alone near the walk-in freezer. Jake approached her, his voice low and threatening. "Don't think this changes anything, Carter. You're still nothing but a burden in my kitchen." Lavinia met his gaze steadily. "This kitchen belongs to all of us, Chef Thompson. We all have a right to work in a respectful environment." Jake sneered, leaning in close. "We'll see about that. Don't get too comfortable." As Jake stalked away, Lavinia let out a quiet sigh. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was prepared for the challenge. She had faced worse in her life and had always come out stronger. Meanwhile, David retreated to his office, closing the door behind him. He slumped into his chair, the weight of the situation heavy on his shoulders. He picked up a framed photo on his desk, a picture of a much younger Lavinia, smiling proudly in chef's whites. "I won't let you down, Mom," he whispered to the photograph. "It's time to make things right." The next morning, tension hung in the air as the staff filed into the restaurant for the mandatory meeting. Jake arrived last, his face set in a defiant scowl. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, as far from Lavinia as possible. David stood at the front of the room, his expression serious. "Thank you all for coming. We need to address the atmosphere in our kitchen. Respect and inclusion are non-negotiable values in this restaurant." Jake snorted derisively, drawing glares from several staff members. David continued, undeterred. "We're going to implement some changes. First, we'll be conducting sensitivity training for all staff members. Second, we're instituting a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior." As David outlined the new policies, Jake's face grew increasingly red. Finally, he burst out, "This is ridiculous. We're running a kitchen, not a damn social club. We don't have time for this touchy-feely nonsense." David fixed Jake with a stern look. "This isn't up for debate, Jake. These changes are happening. If you can't adapt, you'll need to consider whether this is the right place for you." Jake glanced around the room, expecting support from his fellow chefs. Instead, he was met with averted gazes and uncomfortable shuffling. Realizing he was alone in his opposition, Jake stormed out of the meeting, slamming the door behind him. As the meeting concluded, David approached Lavinia. "I'd like you to lead our first sensitivity training session next week. Your experience and perspective will be invaluable." Lavinia nodded, a small smile on her face. "I'd be honored, David. It's about time we address these issues head-on." Throughout the day, Jake's mood oscillated between sullen silence and explosive outbursts. He continued to target Lavinia, nitpicking her work and making snide comments just loud enough for her to hear. During a lull in service, David pulled Jake aside. "Your behavior needs to change, Jake. I won't tolerate this treatment of my staff, especially Lavinia." Jake sneered. "What is it with you and that old woman? Why do you care so much?" David's eyes flashed with anger, but he kept his voice level. "Lavinia is a valued member of this team. Her experience and skills deserve respect. But more than that, she's a human being, Jake. Everyone in this kitchen deserves to be treated with dignity." Jake scoffed and turned away. But David's words had planted a seed of doubt. For the first time, Jake wondered if there was more to Lavinia's story than he knew. As the day wore on, Jake found himself watching Lavinia more closely. He noticed how she moved with practiced efficiency, how younger staff members sought her advice, and how she remained calm and focused despite his constant barbs. During the dinner rush, a crisis erupted. A VIP table sent back their entrees claiming the sauce was off. Jake flew into a rage, berating the line cooks responsible. As he raised his hand, looking ready to throw a pan, Lavinia's voice cut through the chaos. "Chef Thompson," she said firmly, "allow me." To everyone's surprise, Jake stepped aside. Lavinia quickly tasted the sauce, her experienced palate identifying the issue immediately. With a few deft movements, she adjusted the seasoning, transforming the sauce from mediocre to magnificent. The VIP table raved about the revised dishes, and a potential disaster was averted. Jake stood in stunned silence, watching as Lavinia calmly returned to her station. Later that evening, as the kitchen was winding down, David called Lavinia into his office. "Mom," he said softly once the door was closed, "I'm so sorry you have to endure this. Maybe it's time we tell everyone the truth." Lavinia shook her head. "No, David. I don't want special treatment because I'm your mother. I've faced discrimination my whole career. This is no different." David sighed, frustration evident in his voice. "But it is different. You're not just an employee. You're the reason this restaurant exists. Your recipes, your techniques, they're the foundation of everything we do here." Lavinia placed a comforting hand on her son's arm. "I know, sweetheart, but revealing our relationship won't solve the underlying issues. Jake and others like him need to learn respect, not because of who I am, but because it's the right thing to do." David nodded reluctantly. "You're right, as always, but promise me you'll let me know if things get worse. I can't stand seeing you treated this way." Lavinia smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Don't worry about me. I've dealt with far worse than Jake Thompson. He may be talented, but he has a lot to learn about what really makes a kitchen great." As Lavinia left the office, she nearly collided with Jake, who had been hovering nearby. His eyes narrowed suspiciously, darting between Lavinia and David's closed door. "What was that about?" Jake demanded. Lavinia met his gaze calmly. "Just discussing the new training program, Chef Thompson. Is there something you need?" Jake opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it abruptly. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Lavinia to wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, a small crack had appeared in his armor of arrogance. In the days following the staff meeting, a subtle shift began to occur in the kitchen. While Jake's attitude remained largely unchanged, other staff members started to rally around Lavinia. They sought her advice more openly, defended her against Jake's criticisms, and made efforts to include her in their conversations during breaks. David, noticing this change, decided to capitalize on it. He called Miguel into his office one afternoon. "Miguel, I have a proposition for you," David began. "I'm planning an event to celebrate diversity in the culinary world. I'd like you to work with Lavinia to organize it." Miguel's eyes widened with excitement. "Really? That sounds amazing, Mr. Chen. What kind of event did you have in mind?" David smiled, pleased by Miguel's enthusiasm. "I'm thinking a tasting menu that showcases cuisines from around the world. Each dish will tell a story of its origin and the chef who prepared it. And I want Lavinia to be our guest of honor." Miguel nodded eagerly. "That's perfect. Lavinia has so much knowledge and experience. She'll be a great centerpiece for the event." As Miguel left the office, bubbling with ideas, he nearly ran into Jake. The head chef's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "What was that about?" he demanded. Miguel hesitated for a moment before deciding on honesty. "Mr. Chen is planning a diversity celebration event. He's asked me to work with Lavinia on organizing it." Jake's face darkened. "Of course he did," he muttered. "Well, don't let it interfere with your regular duties. We're running a restaurant here, not a cultural center." As Jake stalked away, Miguel couldn't help but feel a twinge of disappointment. He had hoped that Jake might show some interest in the event, or at least not react negatively. Over the next few weeks, preparations for the event kicked into high gear. Lavinia worked closely with Miguel and other staff members, sharing stories from her long career and offering insights into various cuisines. The kitchen buzzed with a new energy as chefs experimented with dishes from their own cultural backgrounds. Jake, however, remained aloof from the preparations. He continued to run the kitchen with his usual stern efficiency, but his demeanor grew increasingly irritable as he saw the staff rallying around Lavinia and the upcoming event. One evening, as Lavinia was teaching a group of young chefs how to make her famous soul food cornbread, Jake approached. "What's going on here?" he demanded. "This isn't social hour. We have a restaurant to run." Lavinia met his gaze calmly. "We're preparing for the event, Chef Thompson. This cornbread will be part of our tasting menu." Jake scoffed. "Cornbread? In a fine dining restaurant? This event is going to ruin our reputation." The young chefs looked uncomfortable, but Lavinia stood her ground. "Cuisine isn't about reputation, Chef Thompson. It's about heart, history, and bringing people together. This cornbread recipe has been in my family for generations. It tells a story that's just as valuable as any French sauce or Italian pasta." For a moment, Jake seemed taken aback by Lavinia's passion, but he quickly recovered, his face hardening. "Just keep it out of the way of real work," he snapped before walking away. As the event drew nearer, David noticed that the staff was becoming more united, while Jake was increasingly isolated. He decided it was time for another conversation with his head chef. "Jake," David began once they were alone in his office, "I've noticed you haven't been involved in the event preparations." Jake shrugged. "It's not my thing. I'm here to run a kitchen, not plan parties." David leaned forward, his expression serious. "This event is important, Jake. It's not just about celebrating diversity. It's about recognizing the value that different perspectives bring to our cuisine. I want you to be part of it." Jake's jaw clenched. "And if I'm not interested?" David sighed. "Then I have to question whether you're the right fit for where this restaurant is heading." As Jake left the office, his mind was in turmoil. For the first time, he began to realize that his position might truly be in jeopardy if he didn't adapt. Meanwhile, Lavinia was having a heart-to-heart with Miguel in a quiet corner of the kitchen. "You know, Miguel," she said softly, "in all my years in the culinary world, I've learned that standing up against discrimination isn't just about protecting yourself. It's about creating a better environment for everyone who comes after you." Miguel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Is that why you've never given up, even when things got tough?" Lavinia smiled. "Exactly. Every time I faced a challenge, I thought about the young chefs who would follow in my footsteps. I wanted to make sure the path was a little easier for them." As they continued to chat, neither noticed Jake lingering nearby, overhearing their conversation. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face as he considered the impact of his own behavior on the younger staff members. The day before the event, the kitchen was a flurry of activity. Chefs from various backgrounds were preparing their signature dishes, filling the air with a symphony of aromas. Lavinia moved from station to station, offering encouragement and advice. Jake stood at the entrance of the kitchen, watching the scene unfold. Despite himself, he felt a twinge of curiosity about the dishes being prepared. As he observed Lavinia guiding a young chef through the intricacies of a complex spice blend, he began to see her in a new light. For the first time, Jake allowed himself to consider that perhaps Lavinia's experience and knowledge were assets to the kitchen, not hindrances. And as he watched the excited faces of his staff as they prepared for the event, he realized that he stood at a crossroads. He could continue to resist the changes happening around him, or he could open himself to new possibilities. As the kitchen buzzed with anticipation for the upcoming event, the stage was set for a potential turning point, not just for the restaurant, but for Jake himself. The morning of the diversity celebration event arrived, bringing with it a palpable sense of excitement and nervous energy. The kitchen staff bustled about, making final preparations for the evening's festivities. Lavinia stood at the center of it all, a calm presence amidst the controlled chaos. Jake entered the kitchen, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He paused at the entrance, taking in the scene before him. The usually regimented kitchen had been transformed. Stations were set up showcasing cuisines from around the world, each one manned by a chef with personal connections to the dish they were preparing. David approached Jake, a cautious smile on his face. "Glad you're here, Jake. We could use your expertise to ensure everything runs smoothly tonight." Jake nodded stiffly, his eyes still scanning the kitchen. "What do you need me to do?" David's smile widened slightly. "Why don't you make the rounds? Check each station, make sure they have everything they need. Your experience could be invaluable in fine-tuning the dishes." With a curt nod, Jake began to move through the kitchen. At each station, he found himself drawn into conversations about ingredients and techniques he had never encountered before. Despite his initial reluctance, he found himself intrigued by the diversity of flavors and cooking methods on display. As the day progressed, Jake felt a growing pressure. He realized that he needed to adapt to this new environment, but years of ingrained behavior were hard to overcome. The turning point came when he approached Lavinia's station. Lavinia was carefully arranging her cornbread on a serving platter, each golden square perfectly positioned. Jake stood watching for a moment before speaking. "Carter, Lavinia," he began, his voice gruff with discomfort. I wanted to apologize for my behavior." Lavinia looked up, surprise evident in her eyes. "Thank you, Chef Thompson. I appreciate that." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "I've been watching you today, the way you work with the staff, the respect they have for you. I think I may have misjudged you." A small smile played at the corners of Lavinia's mouth. "We all have room to grow, Chef. It takes a big person to admit when they've made a mistake." Jake nodded, then hesitated before asking, Would you mind telling me about your cornbread? The recipe you mentioned, the one that's been in your family?" Lavinia's eyes lit up, and she began to share the story of her grandmother's cornbread, passed down through generations. As Jake listened, he found himself drawn in by the rich history behind the simple dish. Their conversation was interrupted by David's voice calling for a final meeting before the event. The staff gathered around, a mix of excitement and nerves on their faces. David beamed at the assembled group. "Tonight is about more than just food. It's about celebrating the diverse backgrounds and experiences that make our kitchen and our community strong. I want to thank each and every one of you for your hard work and dedication." His eyes fell on Lavinia. "And a special thank you to Lavinia, whose wisdom and experience have been instrumental in bringing this event together." As the staff applauded, Jake found himself joining in, his earlier reservations fading in the face of the collective enthusiasm. The event began and the restaurant filled with guests eager to experience the diverse menu. Jake, still somewhat out of his element, found himself drawn to the energy of the room. He moved from table to table listening to guests' reactions and observing the interplay of flavors and cultures. Midway through the evening, David took the stage to introduce Lavinia as the guest of honor. As Lavinia stepped up to the microphone, Jake felt a sudden urge to be part of the celebration rather than a reluctant observer. Lavinia began to speak, her voice strong and clear. "Food has the power to bring people together, to bridge cultural divides, and to tell stories that span generations. Tonight we celebrate not just diverse cuisines, but the diverse experiences that shape each of us." As she continued her speech, Jake made a split-second decision. He approached David and whispered something in his ear. David's eyebrows raised in surprise, but he nodded in agreement. When Lavinia finished speaking, David returned to the microphone. "We have one more special presentation tonight," he announced. "Chef Jake Thompson would like to say a few words." A hush fell over the room as Jake took the stage. He cleared his throat nervously before speaking. "I've spent my career focused on perfecting classical techniques and maintaining strict kitchen hierarchies. But tonight has shown me that there's so much more to culinary excellence than that." He paused, his eyes finding Lavinia in the crowd. "I've learned more in the past few weeks than I have in years, thanks to the diverse perspectives in our kitchen. And I owe a particular debt to Lavinia Carter, whose patience and wisdom have opened my eyes to new possibilities." Jake's words hung in the air for a moment before the room erupted in applause. As he stepped down from the stage, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt excited about the future of his kitchen and the possibilities that lay ahead. The event continued late into the night, a resounding success that left guests raving and the staff beaming with pride. As the last guests departed and the cleanup began, there was a newfound sense of camaraderie in the kitchen. Jake, instead of barking orders, worked alongside his staff, sharing in the satisfaction of a job well done. As the night drew to a close, Jake approached Lavinia one last time. "Thank you," he said simply, extending his hand. Lavinia took it, a warm smile on her face. "Here's to new beginnings, Chef Thompson." Jake nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Indeed, and please, call me Jake." The days following the diversity celebration event brought a noticeable shift in the kitchen's atmosphere. The success of the event had energized the staff, and a new sense of unity permeated their interactions. Jake, true to his word, was making visible efforts to change his management style. As the kitchen prepared for the day's service, Jake gathered the staff for the usual pre-shift meeting. However, this time his approach was markedly different. "Good morning, everyone," Jake began, his tone less brusque than usual. "Before we dive into today's specials, I want to build on the success of our recent event. I'd like each station to incorporate an element inspired by one of the dishes we showcased. Let's see how we can fuse these diverse flavors with our regular menu." The staff exchanged surprised but excited glances. Miguel was the first to speak up. "Chef, I have an idea for incorporating some Mexican-inspired elements into the fish special." Jake nodded encouragingly. "Good, Miguel. Work with the fish station and flesh out that idea. Anyone else?" As ideas began to flow, Jake caught Lavinia's eye. She gave him an approving nod, which he returned with a small smile. Throughout the day, the kitchen buzzed with creative energy. Chefs collaborated, exchanging ideas and techniques as they worked to incorporate diverse elements into the menu. Jake moved from station to station, offering guidance and, to everyone's surprise, asking questions and seeking input. As the dinner service began, there was an air of anticipation. The staff was eager to see how diners would respond to the new fusion dishes. Jake found himself genuinely excited about the menu for the first time in years. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Diners raved about the unexpected flavor combinations, and several requested to speak with the chef to complement the innovative menu. As Jake made his rounds in the dining room, he overheard snippets of conversation praising the new direction of the restaurant. He felt a surge of pride, not just in himself, but in his entire team. Returning to the kitchen, Jake was met with a scene of controlled chaos. The staff was working seamlessly, calling out orders and moving with practiced efficiency. But there was something else too. Laughter, friendly banter, and an overall sense of enjoyment that had been missing before. Jake approached Lavinia's station, where she was expertly plating a dessert that incorporated her cornbread into a sophisticated trifle. "Lavinia," he said, "I have to admit I was skeptical about some of these combinations, but the response has been incredible." Lavinia smiled as she put the finishing touches on the dessert. "That's the beauty of embracing diversity, Jake. It opens up a world of possibilities we might never have considered otherwise." As the night wore on, Jake found himself reflecting on the changes of the past few weeks. He realized that his previous approach had not only been harmful to his staff, but had also limited his own growth as a chef. Towards the end of service, David entered the kitchen, his face beaming. "Congratulations, everyone. Tonight was a tremendous success. The feedback has been phenomenal." The staff cheered, their fatigue momentarily forgotten in the glow of their achievement. David continued, "I think we've found our new direction. From now on, we'll be incorporating this fusion approach into our regular menu. Jake, I'd like you to work with Lavinia to develop a training program. We want to ensure all our chefs are versed in a variety of cuisines and techniques. Jake nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. Absolutely, David. Lavinia, would you be willing to take the lead on this? Your experience would be invaluable. Lavinia looked surprised but pleased. Of course, Jake. I'd be happy to. As the staff began to clean up, the kitchen was filled with excited chatter about the new direction of the restaurant. Jake overheard Miguel talking animatedly with a group of younger chefs. "This is amazing," Miguel was saying. "It's like we're creating a whole new cuisine, blending techniques and flavors from around the world." Jake approached the group. "You're right, Miguel, and I want you all to be part of this evolution. I'll be looking to each of you to contribute ideas and techniques from your own backgrounds." The young chefs looked at Jake with a mixture of surprise and enthusiasm. It was clear that this new, inclusive approach was having a profound effect on staff morale. As the last of the cleanup was completed, Jake called for everyone's attention. "I want to thank all of you for your hard work tonight. What we achieved here, it's something special. I know I haven't always been the most approachable boss, but I want you to know that's changing. My door is always open for your ideas and feedback." There was a moment of stunned silence before the kitchen erupted in applause. As the staff filed out, many stopped to shake Jake's hand or pat him on the back. Lavinia was the last to leave. As she gathered her things, Jake approached her. "Lavinia, I owe you an apology, a real one. I've spent years undervaluing your contributions and treating you with disrespect. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Lavinia regarded him for a moment before responding. "Thank you, Jake. That means a lot, and I look forward to working with you to shape the future of this kitchen." As they left the restaurant together, both felt a sense of optimism about what lay ahead. The kitchen had been transformed, not just in its menu, but in its very culture. And at the heart of that transformation was a newfound respect for the diversity of experiences and perspectives that each member of the team brought to the table. The following weeks saw a flurry of activity in the restaurant as Jake and Lavinia worked together to implement the new training program. The kitchen had become a hub of culinary experimentation and cultural exchange, with chefs eagerly sharing techniques and flavors from their diverse backgrounds. One morning, Jake called a staff meeting to discuss the progress of their new initiative. "I'm proud of what we've accomplished so far," he began, his tone warm but professional. "Our fusion menu has been a hit with diners, and I've seen remarkable growth in all of you. Today, I want to take things a step further." He gestured to Lavinia, who stood beside him. "Lavinia and I have developed a rotational program. Each week, a different chef will have the opportunity to showcase a dish from their cultural background as our special. You'll work with the entire kitchen to refine and elevate the dish, incorporating techniques from various cuisines." The announcement was met with excited murmurs. Miguel raised his hand. "Chef, does this mean we'll all get a chance to lead the kitchen for a dish?" Jake nodded, a small smile on his face. "Exactly, Miguel. This is about more than just creating new dishes. It's about developing leadership skills and learning to collaborate effectively." As the meeting concluded, Jake noticed a new energy in the kitchen. Chefs huddled in small groups, already discussing ideas for their showcase dishes. He felt a surge of pride, realizing how far they'd come in such a short time. Later that day, as the kitchen prepared for dinner service, Jake found himself working alongside Lavinia. They were experimenting with a new dessert that combined elements of French pastry with flavors from Lavinia's soul food repertoire. "You know, Lavinia," Jake said as he carefully caramelized sugar for the dish, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm enjoying being a student again. Your knowledge of flavor combinations is remarkable." Lavinia smiled as she stirred a pot of peach compote. "That's the beauty of cooking, Jake. No matter how experienced you are, there's always something new to learn." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the pantry. They hurried over to find two young chefs in a heated argument over the last bottle of a specialty vinegar. Jake was about to intervene when Lavinia placed a hand on his arm. "Let's see how they handle this," she said quietly. To Jake's surprise, Miguel stepped in. "Hey guys," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Remember what Chef Thompson said about collaboration? Instead of fighting over the vinegar, why don't we think about how we can use it in both your dishes? Maybe we can create a connection between the two specials." The young chefs looked at each other, then nodded sheepishly. As they walked away with Miguel, already discussing ideas, Jake turned to Lavinia with a look of amazement. "Did you see that?" he asked. "Miguel handled that situation perfectly. I couldn't have done it better myself." Lavinia nodded, a knowing smile on her face. "Leadership isn't just about giving orders, Jake. It's about fostering an environment where others can grow and shine." As the evening progressed, Jake found himself stepping back more, observing his team as they worked together to handle the dinner rush. He noticed how they communicated more effectively, offering help and suggestions to each other without prompting. Towards the end of service, a food critic who had visited the restaurant in the past arrived unannounced. Jake felt a momentary panic, remembering how he would have micromanaged every detail of the critic's meal in the past. Instead, he gathered the team. "All right, everyone, we have a food critic in-house, but we're not going to do anything differently. I trust each of you to do what you do best. Let's show them what our new approach is all about." The staff nodded, a mixture of nervousness and determination on their faces. As the critic's order came in, Jake watched with pride as his team came together, each contributing their expertise to create a truly unique dining experience. When the critic requested to speak with the chef, Jake made a decision. He asked Lavinia and Miguel to join him in the dining room. "Good evening," Jake said as they approached the critic's table. "I'm Jake Thompson, the head chef, but tonight's meal was a true team effort. I'd like to introduce you to Lavinia Carter, our culinary advisor, and Miguel Ramirez, one of our talented line cooks. They were instrumental in creating the dishes you enjoyed tonight." The critic looked surprised but intrigued. As Lavinia and Miguel described the inspiration behind the dishes and the collaborative process that brought them to life, Jake saw the critic's expression change from skepticism to genuine interest. Later that night, as they closed up the kitchen, Jake gathered the staff one last time. "I want to thank you all for your hard work tonight. What we achieved here, the teamwork, the creativity, the respect for each other's ideas, that's what cooking is all about. I'm proud to work alongside each and every one of you." As the staff filed out, Jake noticed David watching from the office doorway. The restaurant owner approached, a broad smile on his face. "You've really turned things around, Jake. This kitchen feels like a completely different place." Jake nodded, feeling a sense of accomplishment he hadn't experienced in years. "It is a different place, David, and I'm a different chef. I just wish I'd realized sooner how much I was missing by not embracing the diversity in our kitchen." David patted him on the shoulder. "The important thing is that you've learned, and the best part is, this is just the beginning." As Jake left the restaurant that night, he felt a renewed passion for his craft and a deep appreciation for the team he was privileged to lead. The future of the kitchen looked brighter than ever, full of endless culinary possibilities and the promise of continued growth and learning for all. As the weeks passed, the restaurant's new approach continued to garner attention and praise. One evening, after a particularly successful service, the kitchen staff was unwinding, sharing stories and laughing together. The camaraderie that had developed was palpable. In the midst of this jovial atmosphere, one of the younger chefs, Sarah, turned to Lavinia. "Miss Carter, I've always wondered, how did you end up working here? I mean, with your experience, you could probably be running your own restaurant." A hush fell over the group as all eyes turned to Lavinia. She smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "Well, Sarah, that's an interesting story. You see, I've known the owner of this restaurant for a very long time." Jake, who had been listening nearby, raised an eyebrow. "Really? How long are we talking about, Lavinia?" Lavinia chuckled. "Oh, about 45 years, give or take." The staff exchanged confused glances. Miguel spoke up. "But Mr. Chen can't be more than 40. At that moment, David walked into the kitchen, catching the tail end of the conversation. He looked at Lavinia, a question in his eyes. She nodded almost imperceptibly. David cleared his throat. "I think it's time we shared something with all of you. Lavinia isn't just our culinary advisor. She's also my mother." A stunned silence fell over the kitchen, followed by a burst of exclamations and questions. Jake stood frozen, his mind reeling as he processed this information. "Your mother?" he finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "But all this time, why didn't you say anything?" Lavinia's expression was gentle but firm. "Because it shouldn't have mattered, Jake. My skills and experience should have spoken for themselves, not my relationship to the owner." David nodded in agreement. "We kept it quiet because we wanted Lavinia to be judged on her own merits. And we wanted to see how people would treat her without knowing her connection to me." The implications of this revelation hit Jake like a ton of bricks. All the times he had belittled Lavinia, all the disrespect he had shown her. He had been doing it to the owner's mother. He felt a wave of shame wash over him. I don't know what to say," Jake stammered. "Lavinia, I'm so sorry. If I had known—" Lavinia held up a hand to stop him. "That's exactly the point, Jake. You shouldn't have needed to know my relationship to David to treat me with respect. But the important thing is that you've learned and grown. That's what matters now." The rest of the staff was still processing the news. Miguel looked at Lavinia with newfound admiration. "So all those stories about the struggles you faced in the industry, you were really paving the way for people like me?" Lavinia nodded. "It wasn't easy, but I believed that by persevering I could make things a little better for the next generation of chefs." Sarah spoke up again, her voice filled with awe. Mrs. Chen, your recipes, your techniques, they're the foundation of everything we do here, aren't they?" David smiled proudly. "They are. This restaurant was built on my mother's culinary legacy. I've always known she was the heart and soul of this place." Jake, still reeling from the revelation, turned to David. "Why did you hire me knowing how I might treat your mother? Why did you keep me on when you saw how I behaved?" David's expression turned serious. "Because my mother insisted. She saw potential in you, Jake. She believed that with the right guidance you could become not just a great chef, but a great leader." Jake looked at Lavinia, his eyes brimming with emotion. "You saw that in me, even when I was at my worst." Lavinia nodded. "I've been in this industry a long time, Jake. I've seen plenty of talented chefs let their egos get the best of them. But I also saw your passion for food, your drive for perfection. I knew that if you could channel that energy in the right way, you could do amazing things." The kitchen fell silent as everyone absorbed the weight of this revelation. Then slowly, Miguel began to clap. Others joined in, and soon the entire kitchen was filled with applause for Lavinia. Jake, overcome with emotion, stepped forward and embraced Lavinia. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick. "Thank you for not giving up on me, for teaching me what real leadership looks like." As the applause died down, David addressed the staff. "I hope this doesn't change how any of you view Lavinia or your relationships with her. She's earned her place in this kitchen through hard work and incredible skill, not because of her connection to me." The staff nodded in agreement, many of them looking at Lavinia with newfound respect and admiration. As the night wound down and the staff began to leave, there was a sense that something fundamental had shifted. The revelation of Lavinia's true identity hadn't created division, as some might have feared. Instead, it had cemented the sense of family that had been growing in the kitchen. Jake was the last to leave, still processing everything that had happened. As he turned off the lights, he looked back at the kitchen. For the first time, he saw it not just as a workplace, but as a legacy, one that he was now part of. thanks to the wisdom and patience of an extraordinary woman. The following day, Jake arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual. His mind was still reeling from the revelations of the previous night. As he entered the kitchen, he found David already there, reviewing some paperwork at the prep station. "David!" Jake called out, his voice filled with a mix of emotions. "Can we talk?" David looked up, nodding solemnly. "Of course, Jake. I figured you might have some questions." Jake took a deep breath. "I've been thinking all night about everything that's happened, about how I treated Lavinia, about the kind of leader I've been. I think I need to step down as head chef." David's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Step down? Jake, that's not what we want at all." But how can I continue to lead this kitchen after everything I've done?" Jake asked, his voice strained. "The way I treated Lavinia, your mother, it's unforgivable." David shook his head. "Jake, listen to me. The fact that you're willing to step down, that you recognize your past mistakes, that's exactly why you should stay. You've grown, you've changed. That's what we wanted to see." Jake looked uncertain. "But the staff, how can they respect me now, knowing how I behaved?" "By seeing how you move forward," came a voice from the doorway. Both men turned to see Lavinia entering the kitchen. "Jake, redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about learning from it and doing better." Lavinia approached Jake, her expression kind but firm. "You've already started to change the culture of this kitchen for the better. Walking away now would undo all of that progress." Jake looked between David and Lavinia, his expression a mix of gratitude and determination. "Okay," he said finally. "If you both believe in me, I'll stay. But I want to make things right. I want to do better." David smiled. "That's what we want too, Jake. In fact, I have a proposal for you both." He gestured for them to sit down. "I've been thinking about the future of this restaurant. I want to expand our commitment to diversity and inclusion, not just in our menu, but in our entire operation." Lavinia nodded approvingly. "What did you have in mind, son?" David's eyes lit up with excitement. "I want to start a mentorship program. We'll partner with culinary schools to provide opportunities for students from underrepresented backgrounds. Jake, I want you to lead this initiative, with Lavinia as an advisor." Jake looked surprised but intrigued. "Me? Are you sure?" Lavinia placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "Who better to guide young chefs away from the pitfalls of ego and prejudice than someone who's navigated that journey himself?" Jake felt a surge of purpose. I'd be honored, but I'll need your help, both of you. There's still so much for me to learn." David grinned. "That's the attitude we want to see. Now let's gather the staff. It's time to chart the new course for our restaurant." As the staff filed in for the morning meeting, there was an air of anticipation. Jake stood at the front, flanked by David and Lavinia. He took a deep breath before addressing the team. "Good morning, everyone. After last night's revelations, I'm sure many of you have questions. I want to start by apologizing. My past behavior was unacceptable, not just towards Lavinia, but to all of you. I'm committed to doing better, to being the kind of leader this incredible team deserves." He paused, looking at each staff member. "I understand if some of you have lost respect for me. I hope to earn it back through my actions moving forward. David, Lavinia, and I have been discussing the future of this restaurant, and we want your input." David stepped forward, outlining the plans for the mentorship program. The staff listened intently, many nodding with approval. When David finished, Miguel spoke up. "Chef Jake," he said, his voice firm but respectful, "I won't lie. Learning about how you treated Miss Carter, Mrs. Chen, it was hard to hear. But I've seen how you've changed, how you've helped all of us grow. I think this mentorship program is a great idea, and I'd like to help however I can." Other staff members voiced their agreement. Sarah added, "This kitchen feels like a family now. A weird, dysfunctional family sometimes, but a family nonetheless. I think we all want to be part of making it even better." Jake felt a lump in his throat. "Thank you," he managed. Your support means more than you know. Let's make this restaurant a place where every voice is heard, where every culture is celebrated, together." Lavinia beamed with pride. "I've been in this industry for a long time, and I've never been more excited about the future than I am right now. This is the kind of change I've always hoped to see." As the meeting concluded and the staff dispersed to begin their prep work, there was a new energy in the kitchen. Ideas were flowing freely, with chefs from different backgrounds collaborating on new dishes and techniques. Jake found himself working alongside Miguel, helping the young chef refine a fusion dish that combined elements of Mexican and French cuisine. As they worked, Jake realized that he was learning as much as he was teaching. David watched the scene from his office, a contented smile on his face. Lavinia joined him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've built something special here, son," she said softly. David shook his head. "We've built it, Mom, all of us together, and the best is yet to come." As the kitchen hummed with activity, it was clear that this was more than just a workplace. It was a crucible of creativity, a place of learning and growth, and above all, a family. The journey hadn't been easy, but the destination was proving to be more rewarding than anyone could have imagined.